Hey guys, welcome back to the Hybrid Athlete channel. I'm Dr. Paul Rimmer, and today on our Sports Science Short segment, I'm going to talk to you guys about carbs versus fats. It's a big debate in many sports performance arenas about the benefits of low carbohydrate diets in terms of athletic performance, particularly within endurance sports and particularly within long distance endurance sports. So why might that be? Before I get into this, I want to caveat this whole video with I'm not pro or anti any kind of diet. If you find it works for you for performance, that's great. What I'm here to do is to educate and inform and maybe make people understand where certain elements of a nutritional approach might fall down for them as individuals. Or maybe it might help them, who knows. So when we're talking about a low carb diet, I think there's a difference in a low carb diet and a very low carb, maybe ketogenic diet. I'm not going to get into the mechanisms of what a ketogenic diet is, but basically what happens is if you reduce carbohydrates in the diet to such a significant level, your body then has to produce from fatty acids, from dietary fats, these things called ketone bodies, and the body needs to do that because our brain needs fuel, and normally it runs off glucose. When it doesn't have glucose available from carbohydrates, then basically, our brain needs to convert fats to ketones to do that. So let's have a look at this fat versus carbs debate, okay? So fatty acids are 9 calories per gram, and carbohydrates, and in carbohydrates in the body, we're going to talk about this from the context of the two main sources, which is obviously you've got blood glucose floating around, or blood sugars, if you will, and we also have glycogen, which is the storage form of carbohydrates in the body, and that comes in two forms. It comes of glycogen in the muscle and also in the liver. So fatty acids are 9 calories per gram, and glycogen, carbohydrates are 4 calories per gram. So immediately it might seem, well, hang on a second, fatty acids are 9 calories per gram. That's great, they hold more energy, surely they're better for performance. That's not the whole picture, so that's what we're going to talk about today. So let's move on to the next category if we're going to compare these two things. And one is, first category is how much energy do we store in the body from fat, from stored body fat. So that's stored in our adipose tissue, our subcutaneous fat tissue under our skin, and also there's visceral fat around our organs, and also we also have what's called intramyocellular fat storage, which is just a posh way of saying that's the fat stored inside our muscles. So endurance athletes tend to have a lot of that as well, because fat is a primary fuel source for endurance type activities. Okay, so from stored body fat, we tend to have greater than 50,000 calories, depending on, if you took an average person with maybe 10 to 12% body fat, you're going to have 50, 60,000 calories worth of energy there. Whereas with glycogen, carbohydrates, we only have maybe 500 to 600 grams, depending on body size. Obviously, more people, the more muscle people have, the more glycogen they're going to store. Bigger people tend to have slightly bigger livers and things as well. Organ size can change depending on body size. But typically speaking, you're only looking at 2,000 to 3,000 calories there. So straight away, you're starting to think to yourself, well, hang on a second, fatty acids have more energy per gram, there's more of it in the body. And when you look at the amount of weight, like storage weight, per 100 calories of energy, so if we need 100 calories, how many grams of storage do we need to facilitate that? Think of it like having fuel in the fuel tank. That's around about 12 grams of fat can provide our bodies with around about 100 calories. The reason, obviously fats are 9 calories per gram, but there is some water within fat cells. But within glycogen cells, glycogen molecules, glycogen within the body, it's only 65 grams per 100 calories. So we've almost got like a 4 or 5-fold difference in terms of weight for the same relative amount of energy, about 100 calories. Well, why is that? Well, glycogen, one of the issues with glycogen is although it's lower calorie per gram, it also holds an associated amount of water as well. So 2 to 3 grams of water is stored with every gram of glycogen. So that, even though, if you were to take 100 calories and you divide that by 4 calories per gram, that's 25. But obviously we've got 25 grams of carbohydrates provides the 100 calories. We also have associated water with that as well. So there's more weight rather than just the grams of glycogen. Hopefully that makes sense. So straight away from those main categories there, we can see fatty acids have more calories per gram. They've got more body stores of fatty acids, and the storage efficiency in terms of how many calories, how much weight per 100 calories we have to have in the body is also much, much lower. However, this is where things get a little bit tricky. So if we're doing lots of long, slow endurance exercise type activities, fat as a fuel source is fine. But when we start to increase our volume of work, our intensity of work, not volume, if we start to increase our intensity of exercise or intensity of performance, this is where things shift slightly. So we need 23 molecules of oxygen to fully oxidize one molecule of fatty acid, but we only need 6 molecules of oxygen in order to oxidize to produce energy from glycogen, from carbohydrate. Now it produces much less energy in terms of a per gram basis, but the rate at which we can provide oxygen is obviously limited by our intensity. We can only bring in so much energy at any one time. So as our exercise intensity increases, we need to be more sparing with how much oxygen we can take on board. And the reason for that is simple. So when we oxidize energy, what we're really doing is producing, when we add oxygen to our fuel sources, what we're really doing is producing is ATP, which is adenosine triphosphate, which is our body's energy currency. Okay. So although you obviously get less ATP per molecule of per gram of carbohydrate or gram of glycogen, because it's less calories, ergo less energy. The rate at which we can produce that at higher intensities, because we're more efficient with the oxygen, means that we can then produce energy at a faster rate. So as our exercise intensity increases, we get this sort of, it's called a crossover effect, where then our fatty acid provision of energy, we can only provide so much oxygen before then actually the rates of ATP get lower, rates of ATP generation get slower than if we were using carbohydrates, because it's just more efficient to kind of use all of the oxygen that's available rather than only using some of the oxygen, because only around about 80% of the oxygen that we're breathing in can be used at any one time for fatty acid uptake, because of the way the conversion works at a molecular level. If you haven't seen the video where I talk about how we calculate energy and fuel usage, please check this out. I've linked it here. There's also a fuel usage calculator that is will show you how these kind of how calorie intake and fuel usage shifts over time. So it's the rate of ATP provision and the oxygen demand that's placed on that really then starts to switch things towards glycogen at these higher intensities. And finally, when it comes to that, it comes to the energy provision. If we're doing anything anaerobic, really high intensity work, anything like above our maximum oxygen uptake, fatty acids cannot provide energy without the presence of oxygen on a cellular level, whereas glycogen can, or at least glucose can, with its incomplete glycogen breakdown, but we still get some ATP out of that. Much less, but we can still do it. So now you can see that at lower intensity, fatty acids are great. At higher intensities, carbohydrates really kick in. Now I know advocates of lower carbohydrate diets will say that you can actually, with efficiency over time, you can increase the efficiency at which oxygen is used to provide ATP within those fatty acids. The efficiency of fatty acid breakdowns called beta oxidation. And there's an element of truth to that, but it will still never fully make up that gap. The question also then becomes, is that gap, is the type of training, and the performance that you're doing significant enoughly focused on just pure aerobic work, and you're never going to need to do any higher intensity work, or even in competition, that you really want to completely restrict carbohydrates? Because the problem with that is, if you do that and then you have to have some high intensity work and you decide to then carb up for a few days before, let's say, which is a strategy that people have used, for a lot of people, if you're not used to consuming certain foods, both fats and carbohydrates, that can cause digestive system issues. And that also then means if you're out on an event and there's only certain food provision there, or it's not self-supported, that you might then become reliant on carbohydrates, and that's not going to sit with the digestive system. And it also then would limit, typically speaking, certain types of training modalities at higher intensities, which you can do without carbohydrates, but it's going to make the effectiveness of those sessions and the benefits you get out of them probably a little bit lower. And then there are other factors as well which are equally more important. So the first one is, got nice little logos here. The first one is that if we can't have things we enjoy, like a bit of cake every now and again, do we want to restrict our dietary intake so low in carbohydrates or certain foods that we can't eat things that we enjoy and miss out on life's experiences. And the problem with going, say, very low carb is, again, our body takes time to adapt to that lower carbohydrate state, and then it can feel pretty crappy for a few days. There's a thing, for example, on ketogenic diets called the keto flu. The other side of things as well is that, there are certain processes in the body that rely on glucose, so breakdown of glycogen into blood glucose for energy. So one is the brain, and one is blood cell function. Sorry, brain stopped working there. You've got the images to look at to help me, and I still can't do it. And then there's other things as well, which are things like fruits and vegetables and variety of foods and enjoyment of variety of foods, but they also have electrolytes, vitamins and minerals, things like that as well, which are going to help us have more of a healthy, balanced, performance-oriented diet. And the problem with overly restricting one food source is that you are going to be at increased risk of vitamin and mineral deficiency, and then we start to become reliant on supplements, and then there's issues around the efficacy of those supplements, and as a performance nutritionist, we always talk about saying we should take a food first approach. And the other side of it as well is that in terms of the biggest one for me, in terms of everything else, is just lifestyle, food availability. And is there any benefit in terms of fat loss or performance to going very low carbohydrate? No. There might be times in our training where we periodize our carbohydrate intake. So we might there's a thing called the train low hypothesis, which I'm not going to talk about today. I'll probably cover that in another video at some point. But there's something to be said for doing periods of maybe training in a low carbohydrate state. But remember, low carbohydrate isn't no carbohydrate. So we can, through training, through nutrition strategies that aren't completely restrictive on carbohydrate, still increase our body's efficiency and effectiveness at using fatty acids at intensities that we want. But we also do need to consider that from a lifestyle perspective, from an overall balanced nutrition perspective, and from being able to really push hard when we need to, in most sporting environments, I think only ultra endurance really is where there's an argument to be made for being a very fatty acid fueled dominant environment. Did that make sense? There's only really that as an environment, that as a sport where there's some argument to be made. But I just think there's no evidence to suggest it would give you any real benefit as long as the food availability is there to maintain blood sugar levels, and that you've done the right amount of training with the right balance of nutrition, that you can access both carbohydrates and fats when you need them. So that's my take on it. That's what the current body of science says. So the reality is that you probably don't need to go low carb as an endurance athlete. Yes, we do need to consider that. We need to be able to fuel our bodies effectively across whatever duration it is, and from duration of activity, sport, competition and training. Yes, there are times in training where we might want to train low to get some adaptations. However, for most athletes out there, you probably do want to incorporate some carbohydrates in your diet, because food freedom and everything else we've just discussed. Right, anyway guys, hopefully that was helpful. If you found that useful, give me a like and a subscribe, and I'll speak to you all very soon. Peace.